President Trump keeping up the pressure on lawmakers back here at home as he kicks off the second leg of his overseas trip with a visit to Israel. The president's team in Washington pushing for political victories on health care, tax reform, and the budget. Welcome to a brand new hour of America's Newsroom. I'm Shannon Bream, and today we have a special guest.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Glad to have you.
I'm Rick Leventhal, in for Bill Hemmer. The president pushing his agenda on two fronts, foreign and domestic. The president right now in Jerusalem after visiting Saudi Arabia, saying he has new reasons to hope for peace in the Middle East.
We have before us a rare opportunity to bring security and stability and peace to this region and to its people, defeating terrorism and creating a future of harmony, prosperity, and peace. But we can only get there working together. There is no other way.
Wouldn't that be something? Meanwhile, the president pushing to overcome political barriers to his domestic agenda, directing efforts to marshal support in Congress. Peter Ducey is live on Capitol Hill. Peter, how much movement is there going to be, or can there be, in the Senate this week on health care?
Rick, we're now just 2 days away from finally seeing the updated price tag for the health care bill that the House already passed. So things could move. We just don't know which way, good or bad, for the Republicans. But this Congressional Budget Office score, the original one that predicted 24 million Americans would lose coverage, is now outdated as there were amendments pasted into the bill at the last minute. But that score was the reason that a lot of moderate Republicans in the House voted no. And in the Senate, Republicans can't afford to lose large numbers of their own party because they just have a two-seat majority. In the Senate, the effort to make the House's health care bill into something that can pass there is mostly happening behind closed doors. They've got 13 lawmakers working on it, and then once they come up with something, they'll bring it to the full 100 members, and then they'll start arguing about it.
Obviously, this is important to Republicans, Peter, so how much pressure is the White House putting on the party to deliver them a victory on health care?
There's always pressure, Rick, and the Vice President, Mike Pence, is going to be here again today for a series of behind-closed-doors meetings on a variety of initiatives. And his administration has to decide today whether or not they are going to keep paying insurance companies to participate in Obamacare's exchanges. There's a long-running court battle over cost-sharing reduction payments. A lot of House Republicans really don't like these subsidies, but the White House still has not publicly staked out a clear position about them. If the payments stop, though, insurance companies are expected to flee Obamacare's marketplaces.
Peter Ducey, live on Capitol Hill. Peter, thank you.
All right, and as Peter mentioned, Vice President Mike Pence is heading to Capitol Hill today for a series of meetings with lawmakers to help push the president's legislative agenda. Joining us now, his press secretary, Mark Lauder. Good to have you with us this morning, Mark.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
It's an ambitious agenda. Can you tell us anything about what the vice president will focus on in those meetings today?
Well, when the Vice President heads to Capitol Hill this afternoon, he'll have meetings talking about the budget proposal that'll be rolling out here later this week, and also on tax reform, which is something that's very important to families at home. We've got to get families and help them out by lowering taxes across the board, simplifying the tax code, which is something that President Trump has been talking about since the campaign trail.
He's leaned heavily on the vice president, who obviously has a different resume, a different background, having been a member on the Hill himself, having been a governor. He may be seen as one of his most valuable tools on the Hill. Is he happy to play that role?
Well, I think the Vice President's experience on Capitol Hill also as an executive is definitely something that helps. But ultimately, what we're talking about here is the President's agenda, something that he talked to the American people about and why they sent him to the White House. So when we're talking about enacting a budget that balances within 10 years, that's something that Republicans, the President, and Republican leadership have been talking about for many years. And it's something that the Vice President is looking forward to helping make sure that Republicans see the advantages of and we can get it pushed across the finish line.
I want to read you a bit from a piece in the Wall Street Journal by Alan Blinder. It says Republicans in Congress appear to have struck a Faustian bargain with President Trump. They turn a blind eye to his antics, ethical lapses, possible Russian ties, and sheer incompetence. In return, he supports their hard-right agenda to shred the social safety net and cut taxes on the rich. But now the bargain may be unraveling. Thank heaven. Your reaction?
Well, what I would tell you is that the American people sent President Donald Trump to the White House to enact an agenda that is for the American family, for the American worker. And that's what the president is focused in doing. That's what the vice president is going and working with leaders on Capitol Hill to enact. So we're talking about lower taxes. We're talking about balanced budgets, investing in our military. And those are the kinds of things that the American people want and why they elected Donald Trump.
How closely will the vice president be watching that CBO score we expect on the House health care bill on Wednesday? We know that the efforts in the Senate are very different. It's going to take some time to see if the two meet in the middle where they can. But Wednesday could be a big day for the future of health care reform.
Well, this is a legislative process. We've known that from the beginning. Obviously, we're very happy that the House moved the American Health Care Act a few weeks ago. Now it's going to go to the Senate. But at the end of the day, both sides are going to come together. And the one thing that we know is that Republicans are united, along with President Donald Trump, in repealing and replacing the failure that is Obamacare and providing something that will lower premiums and improve health care access to all Americans. And while this is a process, we'll work through that legislative process. That's entirely where our focus is here at the White House.
Well, and over in the Senate, the vice president's vote could be critical because we know that there are a handful of Republicans that have real concerns about health care reform, whether it's the Medicaid expansion, funding for Planned Parenthood, those state waivers. There are a few folks who have stepped forward on the GOP side to say, like, I'm not sure that I can get on board with the plan as it stands now. The vice president, he's already cast some critical tie-breaking votes and very early on in his tenure.
Well, I think what you're seeing here, though, is you're seeing Republicans across the board coming together around the key principles that where we all agree, and that is that Americans need to lower premiums. We need to expand access. We need to remove the mandates of Obamacare and the taxes that are just crushing job growth and holding our economic growth down. Those are the things where Republicans agree. We can all work together through this process and come up to a bill and provide a health care system that is going to do the things that President Donald Trump said it would do, and what we will deliver on that promise to the American people.
And I want to quickly ask you about the controversy surrounding the vice president's commencement speech at Notre Dame and some students who walked out. I was reflecting back to when President Obama spoke there, being one of, viewed as one of the most pro-choice presidents in history. There was some controversy, so it's not like there isn't some controversy with Notre Dame and students be willing to speak out on that. Your reaction as to what happened this weekend?
Well, I mean, what we saw yesterday at historic Notre Dame Stadium was a stadium filled with over 30,000 people. 3,200 graduates received their degrees from Notre Dame. A small few dozen, maybe 100, chose to walk out on that. But what they actually missed was a message from the vice president that was supporting free speech, freedom of expression, and thought on our university campuses. In so many areas where you see Republicans that are not allowed to even come on campus, the vice president was talking about how the university and higher education experience needs to be something where freedom of ideas can be shared, done so respectfully, because at the end of the day, that is how we're going to work through all the various issues that we have in our country and around the world, is to be able to listen to each other, including people who we may not necessarily agree with, and come together at the end and move everyone forward.
Yeah, we would hope that those are themes and ideals that across the political spectrum we could all agree on. Mark Lauder, great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you.
And we'll have more on that walkout later this hour. An action-packed day still ahead in Israel. Just last hour, President Trump and the First Lady visiting Jerusalem's Old City, where the president wrote a prayer, placing it in the Western Wall. He is the first sitting president to visit the Western Wall. He and the First Lady are now back at their hotel. Meanwhile, later next hour, the president will be meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And later in the afternoon, he will hold a joint news conference with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. This afternoon, Fox News will bring you that live. Plus, at 6 o'clock Eastern, don't miss Special Report with Brett Baer, who will be anchoring tonight from Saudi Arabia with all the latest on President Trump's landmark trip. And this Fox News alert, breaking news back in Washington. Fox News has just confirmed that former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn will decline a subpoena from the Senate Intelligence Committee and will invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege today. Catherine Herridge is live in Washington with details. Catherine, what have you confirmed?
Well, thank you, Rick, and good morning. Within the last hour, people close to the former National Security Advisor have confirmed to Fox News that later today they will reply to the Senate Intelligence Committee that had issued a subpoena requesting records for the Russia investigation. And based on the advice of counsel, Mike Flynn will not be providing records, citing his First Amendment protections, in this case, his Fifth Amendment rights. Now, for some context, there is a legal precedent when records are provided to Congress, it can be argued in the future that they are testimonial in nature, and that by providing those records, the individual has waived their right against self-incrimination in the future. So what we have today is confirmation that General Flynn, for the time being, will not be providing records to that Senate Intelligence Committee, in part because of the highly charged political environment and the recent appointment of the special counsel for this case, Rick.
So this is probably not a surprise on Capitol Hill.
Right.
But what would be the ultimate impact on the Russia investigation?
Well, that's a great question. You recall when the special counsel, the former FBI Director Robert Mueller, was appointed, some members of Congress voiced their concern that this would have a chilling effect on the congressional investigations, or at the very least would slow them down, because individuals such as the former National Security Advisor would refuse to provide testimony or records because they face the potential for criminal jeopardy. So the Flynn case today seems to be the first example of how this may create roadblocks for the independent congressional investigations on both the House and Senate side, though I would emphasize those close to Flynn say that his decision not to provide these records is no confirmation or evidence of wrongdoing in this case, Rick.
And Catherine, I'm not sure you can answer this question, but if Flynn were to deny a subpoena from Mueller, what happens then?
You know, I don't want to give you or the listeners bad information, because I think we're somewhat in unprecedented territory. I do know with great confidence that by refusing to provide the records to these congressional committees, he is seems to be on pretty good legal ground that he has a Fifth Amendment right or a constitutional right against self-incrimination. But again, that special counsel creates the possibility of criminal jeopardy, and it will be it will be sort of a dissuading factor in terms of cooperating with other investigations.
And we know that you will continue to follow this, Catherine.
I'm going
Herridge,
to, yeah,
in
for
Washington.
sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And as we continue to monitor that breaking news on Mike Flynn, former House Intelligence Committee Chairman Pete Hoekstra says that President Trump is getting a bit of a breather in the Russia meddling investigation.
Congress is going to be kind of put on hold, and it's going to take Mueller weeks, if not a couple of months, to actually get his investigation going.
And we are learning more developing news involving former FBI Director James Comey. Britt Hume joins us live to weigh in just ahead.
And North Korea launching yet another missile test and sharpening its threats. What the rogue nation is now saying. Plus this.
On my first trip overseas, I've come to this ancient land to reaffirm the enduring friendship between the United States and the State of Israel.
President Trump getting a lot of praise for his speech in Saudi Arabia. Howard Kurtz, host of Media Buzz, joins us ahead. We understand that former fired FBI Director James Comey has been scheduled to speak in private with House Oversight Committee Chairman Jason Chaffetz today about any records of meetings that he's had with President Trump as Comey prepares to publicly testify on his role in the Russia meddling investigation. That's going to be over on the Senate side. He'll do that publicly. Meanwhile, former House Intel Chairman Pete Hoekstra weighing in just moments ago.
The significance that will come out of this will be the frustration that Chairman Chaffetz will feel, because I think Comey and much of the congressional investigation is going to be sidetracked now that Mueller has been appointed as a special counsel.
Oh, there's a very tangled web here, but Britt Hume, Fox News senior political analyst, is joining us now live to help unravel some of this. Good to see you, Britt.
Hi, thanks, Shannon.
Okay, so we had the development just moments ago that we've learned that Michael Flynn is not going to comply with the Senate subpoena. He's going to invoke his Fifth Amendment right not to turn over these documents, as Catherine Herridge reported. But I know that could really complicate things because there are multiple investigations going on here. What do you think's behind his refusal?
Well, I think he's correct to think that in this current atmosphere that turning over these materials might make it difficult for him to refuse later questions that he might consider to be self-incriminating. But I think what we're looking at here is this kind of thing has happened many times before, Shannon, and what committees can do to get around a refusal like this is to grant immunity from prosecution, what they call it, I guess they call it limited use immunity, so that whatever he says or does or surrenders in the course of cooperating with the congressional investigation cannot later then be used against him by a separate federal investigation, a criminal investigation. So that might be what his lawyer is looking for here, is to protect him from coming out and saying things that could later be used against him if he changes his story or it changes in some small way, and so on. I think his lawyer is doing the smart thing for his client here, but it gives you a very good idea, as Catherine Herridge was suggesting, of just how much of a tangle you get into when you're trying to move forward simultaneously with a big federal investigation at the same time there's a congressional investigation going on, and it tends to stall the congressional investigations to a considerable extent.
Yeah, because if one group of investigators or one investigation has granted that immunity, as you said, limited, purpose immunity, and there are other people that want to talk to Flynn, there's no doubt about that. It can slow things down, as we already know that these special investigations often take years at a time. And the Senate committee has said, don't expect any rush from us. We're going to take as long as it takes. And that one's probably going to get done before the Mueller investigation gets done. So a lot to wait for. In the meantime, we know that House Oversight Committee Chair Jason Chaffetz has said he's going to speak with Comey today. Comey's agreed to publicly testify with the Senate Intel Committee in the next couple of weeks. It sounds like Chaffetz is also looking to get him before House Oversight. We'll see about that. In the meantime, here's a little bit of what Jason Chaffetz had to say about how this whole thing's playing out.
What I have heard is that I believe Director Comey and I are going to have a conversation on Monday, and so I have not spoken directly with him. It's important to remember, nobody's actually seen these documents. Even the reporter at the New York Times has not seen these documents. So there's been an awful lot written and said about it, but I don't even know that the Department of Justice has them. Maybe Director Comey has them. I don't know where they reside. I don't know if they are documents, but we're certainly pursuing them.
But a lot of people trying to get their hands on those documents. In the meantime, a lot of the media has just run full steam ahead with them, assuming the veracity that they exist, they're true, and everything else.
That's right, Shannon, and I think, it is very likely that in the course of these congressional investigations, however glacially they may move, that these Comey notes that he made, memos to himself, to memorialize what is said in various meetings, will come to light, and we certainly imagine that the one that was quoted from by a Comey associate to the New York Times will come to light, and we'll see whether the remarks that what he said there is in their fuller context mean what they seem to mean, which is a big question. And Comey is in a tight spot, Shannon, when he testifies before the Senate Intelligence Committee, because if he takes that comment about can't you give Flynn a break, can't you let this go here, to have been an attempt to impede his investigation, that raises a question of why Comey didn't blow the whistle right there. This is a man, Comey, who has shown a willingness to threaten to quit in the past over things, and if he said not a peep about it, it would suggest that perhaps he did not take it as an effort to impede the investigation. And if he testified to that, obviously that would be very good news for President Trump and his team. But all that remains to be seen. That's the kind of stuff that's going to come out here. Comey will be unlikely to be, he's likely, to be unwilling to testify to certain things. He can't talk really about classified information he may have come across. And he may feel that with this ongoing investigation that he's bound by the same rules he was bound by when he was still at the FBI, which is to say you can't publicly comment on the details of a criminal investigation still unfolding. So I think some of what he said, like what he said to what he and the president said to each other, that's likely to come to light. But how much we will know about what this investigation has found, if anything, I'm doubtful about how much we're going to find out about that.
Yeah, there's always caution with these hearings on the Hill. People get very excited, and sometimes they're nothing but a group. So we'll have to see. Brett Hume, thank you very much. Good to see you.
You bet, Shannon. You too.
And less than 1 hour from now, President Trump will be meeting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. On the agenda, reaching an ultimate deal between Israel and Palestine in the fight to crush terrorists. We'll bring that to you live.
And while the president,
whether it was the group of women, whether it was the families, whether it was the children, anybody, the number one thing they said was, we just want to go home. They don't want to go to the U.S., they want to go to Syria. So our goal is, how do we get these people back home to a safe place?
That was U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, at a refugee camp in Jordan. She is pledging additional U.S. support for millions of refugees who fled Syria's civil war. That vow, to some, seems in contrast to President Trump, whose proposed budget calls for steep cuts to UN funding. Haley's visit marks her first overseas trip as U.S. Ambassador.
He actually sounded presidential. You may agree or disagree with what he said, but he sounded like a president. He laid out his vision. He called for help from those in the Muslim world. It was a much different kind of presentation.
That was former CBS host Bob Schieffer reacting to President Trump's big speech in Saudi Arabia, which is getting a lot of praise in the media and some media. Joining us now to discuss, Howard Kurtz, Fox News media analyst and host of Media Buzz. Do you agree? What does that even mean that he sounded presidential?
Well, it's better than the way the media usually describe this president. Look, right. Even the president's most ardent critics, most of them I should say, are calling this a substantive and well-delivered speech, softer tone on Islam, well-received in Riyadh, and a good start to the trip. But in terms of media coverage, other stories, Rick, are already starting to crowd it out. Washington Post lead story this morning. President's budget makes massive cuts to Medicaid. And as you were discussing with Brit Hume moments ago, and it's been a bigger deal on other networks, Mike Flynn, the former national security advisor, declining a Senate subpoena. So no matter how much Trump makes news on this overseas trip, the media are not ready to let go of this Russia story, especially now with the special counsel's investigation.
And the media has been reluctant to praise Trump on any level. I know there's been a recent study that demonstrated that.
That Harvard study is amazing. 80% of the coverage negative in the president's first 100 days, 91 or over 90% on CNN, NBC was also negative. But here's the thing. This reminds me of when the president gave that other very well-received speech to Congress, got about 24 hours of high praise, and then suddenly other stories overtook it, and the president himself issued that tweet about Barack Obama, had targeted him for wiretapping. So the difference here is president hasn't been tweeting. He hasn't gone off script. He read that very well-crafted speech. So to the extent that he can be more disciplined in his message, whether he's overseas or back home here in Washington, he tends to get more positive coverage, even from a media establishment that is not particularly well disposed toward Donald Trump.
For viewers who may have missed yesterday's speech, we want to play a short clip from it. The president making clear that his priority is America, but also this partnership with the Arab world. Let's listen.
America is a sovereign nation, and our first priority is always the safety and security of our citizens. We are not here to tell other people how to live, what to do, who to be, or how to worship. Instead, we are here to offer partnership based on shared interests and values.
Firm and directed and not pandering to the audience.
Very much so, and coupled with an appeal to drive the terrorists out of the religious sphere and the community, to try to form some kind of alliance there. But if you look at that soft-spoken tone, I mean, that contrasts with the more bombastic Trump that we see at rallies and so forth, and very appropriate, for his first major speech on the first foreign trip as commander-in-chief. And so I think that's why he is getting some good coverage. But again, it's going to be a split-screen presidency during this 9-day trip. But he will make news today in Israel, and obviously when he goes and meets with the Pope and at the Vatican. At the same time, journalists here at home are going to be focusing on some of the scandal stories and others, and they will be sort of competing for ink and airtime, Rick.
Howard Kurtz, host. President Trump on a historic visit to the Holy Land. Right now, we're waiting for his meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. The two met earlier during the president's arrival ceremony, sharing a warm welcome at Ben Gurion Airport. Later, he met with Israeli President Reuven Rivlin at his residence in Jerusalem, expressing hope for the ultimate deal.
It's a challenge and it's an opportunity. But you have a great opportunity right now. There's a great feeling for peace throughout the Middle East. I think people have just had enough. They've had enough of the bloodshed and the killing, and I think you're going to see things starting to happen. What we did over the weekend was, they say there's never been anything like it ever before.
John Huddy is live in Jerusalem. The president keeping a pretty aggressive schedule today. John, what does the rest of his day look like?
Yeah, he really is. It's a busy day for the president. As you mentioned, Rick, he'll be meeting with the Prime Minister Netanyahu, today, and then he'll have some downtime, some free time at the King David Hotel here in downtown Jerusalem, about maybe a 10-15-minute walk from our bureau, from the studio here. And then after that, later this evening, Rick, he'll be meeting with the Prime Minister again and having dinner with Prime Minister Netanyahu, his wife Sarah, and also the First Lady. Earlier, President Trump visited Jerusalem's Old City, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, going in by himself. There are no cameras allowed in there, privately. And then also the Western Wall. He went up to it, as we saw, put his hand against the wall, and then put a note in the wall, traditionally, usually a prayer. Earlier, before that, as you mentioned, he met with Israeli President Reuven Rivlin at the president's residence. And during some remarks he gave, he talked about how he was encouraged by his meetings in Saudi Arabia with Muslim leaders and the prospect of peace in the Middle East, and also Saudi King Salman's hope for peace with Israel. So that was fairly significant, and possibly business ties. You know, Israel's high-tech industry already does business in Dubai and the UAE, so maybe we'll see something similar to that. And of course, Rick, one of the main topics here, if not the main topic, along with the settlements, the U.S. Embassy possibly moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, is about peace, restarting peace talks between the Israelis and Palestinians. Tomorrow, the president will be meeting with Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president, in Bethlehem, Rick.
John, Shannon and I were talking earlier as the president's motorcade was moving through Jerusalem, just how tough security is there. I'm also wondering what the mood is on the ground. Yeah. Can you give us some perspective?
Well, yeah, security, I mean, you know this, Rick, you've been here. Security is always high in Jerusalem, but now for the president's visit, more than 10,000 police officers, we're talking municipal police, border police, Shin Bet, are on duty. They've set up numerous road closures, blockades here in Jerusalem, in particular, the city center, the old city, which was like a ghost town today, and also downtown Jerusalem, where the president is staying, is really locked down. I live in the city center, Rick. I took my dog for a walk this morning to Independence Park, which is near the hotel, and it was like a fortification. It was really locked down. You know, people always moan and groan about the road closures, but you know, people understand the historic significance of this trip. Last night I went to dinner downtown. That's what people are talking about. You know, the waiter came over, asked me about the president's trip, what I think is going to come out of it. So this is something everybody's talking about, and now the day is here.
Yeah,
right?
And we will see what comes out of it. John Huddy in Jerusalem, thank you very much.
Well, the president receiving a warm welcome on his arrival in Israel.
We love Israel. We respect Israel. From your friend and ally, all of the people in the United States of America, we are with you.
Your visit here, Mr. President, is truly historic. Never before has the first foreign trip of a president of the United States included a visit to Israel.
Karl Rove is a former White House Deputy Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush and a Fox News contributor. Good morning, Karl.
Morning.
All right, I think this might be one of the only stories that we've been talking about that you wouldn't have a whiteboard for, although you could, you know, put out points about the trip, I guess. There's no math on this one, but there is a calculated change in the conversations, both with Saudi Arabia and now we're seeing in Israel. How do you think our partners there in the region see this administration treating them differently than the last one did?
Well, the Saudis and the Gulf states and Jordan and our friends in the region see Egypt, see a president who is not have at the top of his list Iran, and somehow Iran into the broader Mid-Eastern community and the broader world community. They see somebody who's got a cold-eyed realism about the threat from Iran and about the threat from Islamic terrorists, and so they welcome this. They want the United States to be a resolved and dedicated ally in both of these efforts to constrain Iran and to defeat terrorism, and so that's welcomed. In Israel, ironically enough, the fact that the president is seen as a strong ally of Israel makes the chances of peace talks somewhat better, because President Obama was seen as trying to be the neutral moderator, the neutral mediator in between Israel on one side and the Palestinians on the other. And when the Palestinians see America acting in that way, they simply say, let's run the clock longer, because the longer that we play difficult and hard to get, the more America will give us concessions in order to get this situation resolved. So ironically enough, by showing up and saying, we're your strong ally, Israel, we love you, we're your friend, he's telegraphing to the Palestinians, you know, if you want to get a deal, you better define a deal that's in your interest, because I'm not here to sort of speak on your behalf to the Israelis and try and pressure them to accept things they might not otherwise accept.
What do you make of those who say that they've, on the Palestinian side, been, quote, pleasantly surprised by President Trump's willingness and openness to talk with Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, that he's had some words to say to the Israelis about settlements, that he hasn't immediately moved the embassy to Jerusalem? It doesn't look like that's going to happen. You know, there are those who say this is a different tone than they expected from this president on those issues, and a lot of people aren't happy about that.
Yeah, look, I think from the Palestinian perspective, you hit it exactly right. They were expecting the worst, and they haven't gotten as bad as they thought. So there is, you know, some willingness, there's openness to talk to them. You know, look, he's a deal maker, but there's a cautionary note in being a deal maker. This deal, Middle Eastern peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis, will not get done simply because an American president wants to get it done. It will only get done if the Palestinians and the Israelis see it in their interest to arrive at an accommodation. And there's some big thorny questions here. You touched on one of them, the settlements. The Palestinians object to the settlements on the West Bank. The question is, do they want to accept what they got or try and roll them back? Do we have a one-state or two-state solution? We've had a policy for the last 20 years of believing that ultimately the answer is a two-state solution. Israel with defensible borders and a Palestinian state. President Trump said, well, I may be in favor of a one-state solution, which is not really clear what that means. We also have a huge issue with the Palestinians, and that is their continuing support, albeit in an indirect way most of the time, but a direct way in some instances, for a culture of terrorism. The indirect way is by fostering an education system that causes young people to hate Israel, and in a direct way by funding the families of terrorists. And this is going to be a domestic issue here in the United States. Senator Lindsey Graham has a bill that's getting bipartisan support in the House and Senate, the Taylor Force bill, that would basically deny the Palestinian Authority U.S. funds if they continued to fund, to pay payments, if you will, to the families of suicide bombers. So this is going to be a big issue. The real question is, at the end of the day, do the Palestinians see that it is in their interest, the interest of the Palestinian people, to live in peace and security with their neighbor Israel or not? And that's a big question that only they can answer.
Yeah, and the president hopes to jumpstart that conversation. Karl Rove, good to see you on this Monday.
You bet. Thank you. Happy Monday.
Thanks.
In case you missed it, dozens of students turning their backs on Vice President Mike Pence at a commencement ceremony yesterday. Why? Why the Vice President received such a rude welcome by some students, a fair and balanced debate. Plus,
his first international trip as the commander-in-chief. We are now awaiting a meeting between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. You saw them earlier today. Together, they are going to meet for some private time together and then have a live joint press conference a little bit later. We will bring that to you live. I believe that's about 12:25. We'll have it for you live here Eastern Time, Fox. And the First Lady visiting a hospital in Jerusalem. And it looks like we may be getting video of her now. Rick, we've been waiting and seeing them jointly together. Now she and we believe Mrs. Netanyahu there are going to visit the hospital and do some charitable work as a part of the president's visit to that region. Always good to build goodwill in all ways that they can. And this is after the First Lady and President had visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre this morning and then went over to the Western Wall together with the president. Was the first U.S. sitting president to visit the Western Wall. And he placed his hand on the wall and paused there for a time. We lost the feed momentarily, got some video of it later. It did appear that he placed a piece of paper, as traditionally is done there in the Western Wall. And we don't know what it said. That's the beauty of what happens there.
And we may never know what that prayer was. These ladies are at the Hadassah Ein Kerem Medical Center in Jerusalem, in case you're wondering at home. The First Lady is scheduled to visit a hospital garden there with Mrs. Netanyahu. wife of the Israeli prime minister.
Yeah, Sarah Netanyahu. We saw them talking earlier this morning when they were originally together, the four of them. And interesting that we were able to pick up a lot of their banter and conversation back and forth. And Israel's essentially first lady, the prime minister's wife, Sarah Netanyahu, saying we could hear a little bit. There were a lot of aircraft engines and things going on, but a little bit expressing her admiration for the first lady, Melania Trump. And they had a very cordial conversation and some talking back and forth. As you imagine, world leaders on that stage and their spouses, only they can understand what it must be like to be in that position and to live in that very specific bubble as the world is watching. But now again, doing a charitable event today. Don't know if we can hear anything from them, if it's worth listening in. No sound here, but we can see that they're going to visit.
No audio, but a beautiful shot.
It is.
A beautiful live shot inside the hospital.
And they look very excited there, as you see Mrs. Netanyahu. Apparently, it appeared they're maybe clapping her hands.
I hear audio now.
Too. Yeah, their visit there, as you said, at the garden there, and potentially with some patients as well. And again, this comes amid a 9-day trip for President Trump, in which he is going to be hitting a lot of hot spots. The First Lady along, and as well his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who has been given a really pivotal role to try to work towards brokering Middle East peace. It's a heavy lift. It's a big assignment, but he and others have been working behind the scenes for quite some time to try to at least get those channels open again, those talks going again. And the first daughter, Ivanka Trump, who is a senior White House advisor on this trip as well.
Listen, many presidents have tried to broker a peace deal between the Israelis and Palestinians, and they've failed. But there are many or some who think that President Trump just might be the kind of person who can broker a deal in this situation. It's usually not the guy in the middle. It's usually the people on the other ends, and they cannot and will not get along or come up with a solution. But maybe the art of the deal can be found here in Jerusalem.
I mean, it's clearly the ultimate challenge for him. They're calling it the ultimate deal, what he would love to see happen during his presidency for the sake of that region and for all around the world, the impact it would have if those two entities could find peace.
It would be remarkable.
It would be, and a lot of people think nearly impossible. But as you said, it's not about the negotiator. It's about the two leaders on opposite ends who have to sit down and be convinced, as Karl Rove was saying minutes ago, that it's in their best interest to find a solution and to move forward. And as we've noted all morning, the president has been unwavering in his support of Israel. A lot of folks on that end and in that country, and certainly the prime minister, have welcomed that and said it's been a welcome change. They've celebrated it. They've celebrated the election of this president, what they hoped it would do for the U.S.-Israel relationship. But there have been some bumps in the road, too, as there have been those who feel that the president's been not as strident as they thought he would be on the other side of the equation with the Palestinians. But they are praising him for having open conversations with Mahmoud Abbas, and he'll do that on this trip as well.
And so much attention focused on the president's visit to the wall this morning, which is the first time a sitting president has done that, and questions about whether or not that actually supported a move of the embassy, the U.S. embassy, the Israeli, to Jerusalem instead of Tel Aviv, and
which he promised continually during the campaign. I mean, repeatedly.
We don't know, do we? What his thoughts are on that or where this could lead. But what we're seeing is a remarkable visit by a sitting president.
Yeah, and now he, after this, he'll, of course, travel on to Rome and meet with the Pope. That'll be an interesting conversation. And to NATO and Brussels and beyond that to Sicily as well. So it is a jam-packed trip. The First Lady along on this trip for 9 days, for an extended time that they will be on the international stage. While there is still so much going on, as we've talked about domestically in the world as well, with efforts on health care and tax reform, numerous investigations. There's a lot going on in D.C.
The First Ladies are getting briefed right now by someone at the hospital. They have not yet visited the garden, I'm told, but that will be the next stop on this tour of the hospital there in Jerusalem.
Yeah, and this is always one of the nice things that we see with these visits, that there are charitable endeavors and goodwill endeavors that go along, often with the first spouses of the world leaders as they are on the stage, tackling different topics. A lot of times this goes a long way towards building good relationships, and certainly, putting a good face on the visit and spotlighting charitable events and hospitals like this and places that are important to folks there on the ground, and signaling the U.S. Wants to be involved in caring about those events, as well as the two essentially First Ladies are there and getting ready to travel on to the garden area area we know they'll visit. And we've seen a blossoming relationship between the Netanyahus and the Trumps as they are on the world stage together and sitting down and breaking bread over having conversations we can only imagine to be a fly on the wall, but about the very serious issues that both nations face.
Seems to be a slightly different relationship between the president and prime minister than the former president and prime minister.
Much more tension-filled. We can all remember the leaks that we would get from their conversations or from their meetings or phone calls alleging some, maybe at times, salty language about one another or some very direct conversations.
Yeah. You get the sense these two actually do get along.
Yeah, and they seem to be very united in one key thing, and that is Iran. And the president made unmistakably clear in his remarks in that region over the weekend that they are united, Israel and the U.S., in making sure that Iran does not have nuclear weapons.
And we know that
be nothing more uniting.
Yeah, we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu is very concerned about Iran and nukes, and that was a point that the president made in Riyadh yesterday to the 50 other Arab leaders, the leaders of the Muslim world, that Iran was a common enemy. So that could be the bridge that unites the Arabs and the Israelis, potentially the Palestinians as well, although that gets a little more complicated.
But we know it was an irritant in the region to a lot of people, and certainly of concern to Israel when the last administration hammered out that nuclear deal with Iran, which they said was making sure that they could keep an eye on what Iran was doing and that it had built-in safeguards and that it was actually better and safer for the region. We know many in Israel certainly did not view it that way.
And apparently there were many Arab leaders who didn't like that deal either. At least that's what I'm hearing.
And you've spent a lot of time in this region. You know how complicated and difficult these relationships are. I mean, even the geography of the region, there are streets and neighborhoods that are, one by one under, conflict as to who owns what.
Yeah.
Street, where can you go from here? I mean, it's a very delicate region, and these are very delicate relationships.
And it does often come down to geography. And when you talk to people in Israel about who owns what and what belongs to whom, they will go back, their arguments will go back not hundreds of years, but thousands of years. And it's hard to bring two sides together when they're saying that they've had this land for thousands of years, and each of them has an argument to back it up.
And another thing that we saw, and this feeds off of Iran, which the president boldly called out, saying that they are supporting terrorist organizations. We saw the unveiling of that beautiful, I don't know if you saw the video and the event, of this beautiful counterterrorism center with hundreds of people monitoring computers and saying, we've got to look at things like social media and the use of technology as a way for terrorists. And visit about in that region, the population is very young in certain areas. And if they don't feel hopeful towards the future, that they have economic interests or jobs or a path forward, that they're much more susceptible to the people who would prey on them and who would recruit them into these organizations. So
again, we're looking at live pictures of the First Lady Melania Trump visiting a hospital in Jerusalem with the wife of the Israeli Prime Minister.
To see the now, but think about years ago, these visits, you would wait for still photos, you would wait for feeds, and now we get to see things in real time, which is amazing on a trip like this because, as we've said, every word that's said, every gesture, every handshake, all of it means something to the world as they are watching the world stage.
Tell me again, producer, what the bench is.
Oh, it's dedicated to, apparently, Melania and Sarah Netanyahu and their visit to commemorate their visit there today.
I'm going to make a bold prediction. They're going to sit on that bench.
And it won't be controversial. Everyone can support being hopeful at the hospital and as they sit together. And again, these families getting to know each other. The president and the prime minister in just moments will be meeting together on their own as they prepare for public statements and remarks this afternoon. And again, we continue to see the hospital visit where they're now proceeding into that garden where, as Rick predicts, should we?
It's not confirmed. I have sources.
To sit on the bench?
I have sources that suggest they will sit on that bench. It's unconfirmed at this hour.
We'll see.
But what is confirmed is that after the president meets with the Prime Minister of Israel, he plans to meet with Mahmoud Abbas.
Right.
And the Palestinian leader, and that is also a key meeting, obviously, and part of this whole hope that the president might actually be able to broker a peace deal between these two sides that have been warring for centuries.
Yeah, we've talked about him being a negotiator in chief. We had former House Speaker Newt Gingrich say this is a big step in the right direction, whole emphasis on partnership, working together in this region, talking about his speech, saying it fits who Trump was as a businessman. He believes in partnerships. He believes in bringing people together for a big project. And Rick, I think we could all agree there's really no bigger project in that region right now than trying to broker peace.
And it would be so amazingly positive for this region, which has been so torn by this conflict for so long. You know, every time you visit there, you ask people, how are you doing? And they'll just say, they'll shrug and they'll say, the situation. They call it the situation. It's a chill on the entire region. And if you could remove that chill, if you could open this up, it would change the lives of so many people.
It literally would change the world, because you think about generations of people growing up with being born into a conflict that has existed, as you said, for generations. When children grow up in that, it's the only thing they know. It may be hard for some of them to even picture or imagine a time of where there would be peace. It would be such a radical change there. And
I've been to the Palestinian territories, and if you've been there, it is not a happy place. It is a grim environment to grow up in.
Well, and White House aides, by the way, we should note, they've been downplaying the expectations for significant progress on a peace process during this stop. Some of them are saying that a lot of this initial trip is going to be more symbolic than substantive.
Yeah.
It's sort of laying the groundwork, having these conversations. But as you mentioned, with the president being willing to meet with all the key players and to say, well, I'm here in the region, this is about finding a solution that works for everyone, if that's possible. They don't want to overplay what the president may certainly.
You got it somewhere.
You do.
And this is a fresh start for President Trump and for the Israelis and Palestinians, we hope.
In the meantime, as that goes on, we continue to watch a charitable visit here. The First Lady, Melania Trump, and the Prime Minister's wife, Sarah Netanyahu, visiting a hospital there on a goodwill tour today.
If they're going to sit on the bench, it will probably happen during Happening Now, which will pick up coverage of this live event when we say goodbye.
And now you're back in Israel? Where do you like best, America or Israel? Huh? This is a difficult question.
I know. Both places, right? Maybe half time here, half time there.
Yes, very nice. And what are you doing here? Can you tell us something about?
Just Hadassah Ein Kerem.
We continue our coverage here on Fox News. Thank you to Shannon and thank you to Rick as well, as we continue to watch the First Lady visit with the wife of Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel at a key hospital. In fact, Leland Vitter's with us on set today. Leland, you spent many years reporting out of Jerusalem, our Jerusalem bureau. You were mentioning a little something about the hospital itself and its significance.
Well, it's significant to be visiting this hospital, and you see the woman that they're meeting with there. So you've got Melania Trump in the white, Sarah Netanyahu, the Prime Minister's wife, in yellow, and the woman in red, based on her headscarf, would be Arab. And these hospitals throughout Jerusalem, whether it is Hadassah Ein Kerem or Hadassah on Mount Scopus, all treats not only Israeli Arabs, but Palestinians, whether they get injured in the West Bank in clashes, whether they get injured down in Gaza in Israeli airstrikes or in other kinds of attacks. Some of the best medical care in the world is at these hospitals, and there are Palestinian Israeli doctors there.
What I think is so important about what you're saying, as someone who visited Jerusalem, visited Israel, but haven't lived there in the way that you have, Leland, is that sometimes our perception of Israeli-Palestinian relations is different than what you experience when you're actually there on the ground, how valuable it is to be on the ground as a private citizen, but also as a world leader. President Trump making this trip with him, reasons why we end up bringing you to the meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, and where we expect the president to speak in a short while from now. This is all part of the package. How do our countries look together? How do we literally sit together? What is the behavior like? And how will that broadcast to the world what our relationship will look like going into the future of this administration?
Absolutely. You see a young Israeli boy there with a yarmulke on, a religious young man sitting next to an Arab mother. Clearly, the mothers of both of those children have the same thoughts, which is they just hope their kids get better there. And, you know, we talk about real estate, as President Trump began his career in for so long. Where they are is entirely about real estate, and there's nothing quite like ground truth. With that, we bring in our man, Drew, released his voice, John Roberts, not too far from there, overlooking where the president is at the King David Hotel. Hi, John.
Hey, good morning to you, Leland, or good afternoon to you from Israel, territory that you're very familiar with. You know, this really is a